There's a generation that nobody talks about very much. Not because they're boring, not because nothing happened to them, but because they learned very early on that nobody was really watching. They are Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, sandwiched between the boomers who came before them and the millennials who came after. Too young to be taken seriously by one generation, too old to be understood by the next. And somewhere in that middle space, they became something quietly remarkable. But to understand who Gen X is today, you have to understand what they grew up in. The world that shaped Gen X was not soft. Divorce rates in the West were climbing fast. Both parents were working. After-school supervision was minimal. The term latchkey kid was invented for them. Children who came home to an empty house, let themselves in with the key around their neck, and figured out the next few hours on their own. Nobody scheduled their time. Nobody optimized their childhood. They were just left to exist. And they did. They rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. They watched whatever was on television with no parental filter. They got into things, made mistakes, and sorted them out without a therapist or a parenting book or a structured intervention, not because their parents didn't care, but because that was simply how the world worked then. What this created was a generation with an unusually high tolerance for ambiguity. Gen X learned that the world was not going to organize itself around their needs. And instead of resenting that, most of them just adapted. They became self-reliant not as a philosophy but as a survival skill. Independence wasn't something they chose. It was something that was handed to them by circumstance. This is why Gen X tends to be quietly skeptical. Not cynical in a bitter way, but skeptical in a practical way. They grew up watching institutions wobble. They saw governments lie, companies downsize loyal workers, and the traditional life script, study hard, get a good job, buy a house, retire comfortably, start to crack around the edges. They didn't trust the system because the system had already shown them it wasn't entirely trustworthy. And that skepticism turned out to be useful. It made them adaptable. It made them realistic. It made them hard to panic. Then came the forgotten part. When the conversation about generations started dominating culture, Gen X was mostly left out. The boomers had their moment. Then suddenly millennials were everywhere. Their struggles with student debt, housing, and mental health filled newspapers, podcasts, and think pieces. Gen Z followed quickly with their digital fluency and social awareness. And Gen X watched all of this from the side, largely unbothered, occasionally amused, because being overlooked was nothing new to them. Psychologists who study generational identity point to something interesting here. A generation that grows up with lower levels of external validation tends to develop a stronger internal compass. When nobody is applauding you, you stop performing for applause. You start doing things because they matter to you, not because someone is watching. Gen X, largely unseen by the cultural spotlight, developed a quiet self-sufficiency that doesn't need to announce itself. This shows up in how they handle difficulty. Study after study on resilience points to the same ingredients: a sense of agency, the experience of working through problems without immediate rescue, and a realistic rather than idealized view of the world. Gen X was, almost accidentally, raised on all three. They weren't told they were special every day. They weren't protected from every disappointment. They weren't given trophies for participation. And as uncomfortable as some of that sounds, it produced adults who are remarkably steady under pressure. That doesn't mean Gen X has no wounds. Every generation carries something. Many Gen X adults grew up with emotional needs that weren't always named or addressed. Asking for help felt like weakness because self-sufficiency was the only model they had. Processing emotions out loud wasn't part of the culture they were raised in. You got on with it. You handled it. You didn't make too much noise about the hard stuff. And for some, that stoicism became a wall, a way of coping that worked fine until it didn't. There's also the particular grief of being in the middle. Gen X grew up without the post-war optimism that shaped the boomers, and without the digital fluency that comes naturally to millennials and Gen Z. They straddle two worlds. Old enough to remember life before the internet, young enough to have had to adapt to it fully. They carry both analog memories and digital habits. They know how to look something up in a library and how to Google it. They can navigate both worlds, but they fully belong to neither. And that in-between place, while useful, can feel quietly lonely. But here is what rarely gets said about Generation X. They are perhaps the most adaptable generation alive right now. Not because they were trained to be, but because they had to be. They were shaped by change, not by stability. They grew up in one world and built their adult lives in a completely different one, and most of them made that transition without much fanfare or support. They raised children differently than they were raised. They brought more emotional awareness into parenting than their own parents often had. Not because someone told them to, but because they remembered what it felt like to need more. They built careers in a landscape that kept shifting. They absorbed technology, financial crises, and cultural upheaval with a steadiness that often goes unnoticed. And maybe that's the most Gen X thing of all. Doing the work without needing the recognition, adapting without making a speech about it. Being quietly capable in a world that was mostly looking somewhere else. They were never the loudest generation. They were never the most celebrated. But they were, in many ways, the most prepared for exactly the kind of world we're all living in now. Uncertain, fast-moving, and asking more from people than it gives back. They just never made a big deal about it. Because that's not really their style.